just be absorbed in Suriname and to experience Suriname the way they want to experience, and to reflect on their own work in relation to what they experience, or not. All you are asked to do is keep the journal. Yes, and the journal is also not specified how, in drawings, in sketches, in text, etc. And Cornelius is going to tell us about his work as an artist and architect. And so I will not do formal introductions. You will tell us.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm Cornelius Tulloch, as she mentioned, and coming from Miami through DVCAI here to Suriname has been really interesting and exciting, and I'm glad I get to share my work with you to give you a little bit more insight. I think describing myself, artist, architect, I'm kind of all over the place in terms of creating, but I see the power in kind of interdisciplinary creating, whether it's through music and art or film and fashion or different things. So I really just love the storytelling, and I think that's really why my work transcends these boundaries of like photography, architecture, and fine art, because I see the power in creating a moment, an experience within my work, and why I also collaborate with a lot of other artists in creating kind of my work, because it's like on one scale it's creating 2D photography and painting, but it's also kind of like a production where there may be performance added or architecture, all these different things to really allow people to be absorbed into this world that I'm creating with these narratives. And a lot of my work now has began to bring back in my architecture background, and just about me, like, you know, when I was in high school, I went to a specialized like art and design high school, and then from there I went out to university to study architecture, and I saw how architecture wasn't just about the form of the building, but like the lived experience within the built environment, and seeing moments of just exchange and humanity within it. And I saw that more as like where I wanted to focus on architecture. So I started, you know, out of school. My parents, my mom's African-American, my dad's Jamaican, and very Caribbean mindset to go into STEM. And I think that's part of also my interest in architecture. And he was like, you know, my parents are like, oh, so when are you gonna get your license? And I'm like, I'm deciding, you know, whether I want to fully jump into it. So I mean, I started working for some firms and stuff, and then I realized it wasn't fun. It wasn't what I wanted to do. It was interesting, and on paper, it was like the perfect path of like going to this and that state, these schools, you work for this firm, but it just wasn't fulfilling. So for me, I just reverted, and a lot of people gave me advice to just take a leap of faith, and if I knew what I wanted to do in art, to just go with it, and then everything else will come kind of with time. So I stopped working for firms and just started putting into my artistic practice. We go into the next slide, can stem some into this background, really seeing kind of photography, but also painting was a really strong thing that I started early on learning. In painting influences kind of all the work that I do, whether it's through color and lighting, but also, if you go to the next slide, the series Caribbean Contemporary was about using all the technical skills that I learned through my education, but seeing that work had a very American and Eurocentric lens to how I was creating artwork, and I wanted to bring in Caribbean narratives into the work. So looking at, like, for me as a person, or in a portrait of a person, you just see a person, but you don't always know what their cultural background is. So in this portrait, I started to bring in fruits and vegetables from both the south of the U.S. and also Jamaica to explain my own cultural heritage, with my mom being from Miami and her family being from Georgia, and then my dad being from Jamaica. And growing up in Miami is very cultural meld, is I guess the word for it. So I always say, like, you know, in the morning I'm eating ackee and saltfish for breakfast, but in the afternoon I'm eating like a southern spread, but that was just what my house was. And even in these spaces, I saw how much the culture shifted and merged in between the two. Add to a lot of spaces, and that's why it's been interesting here because there's so many cultures constantly in conversation, constantly through the architecture, through the meals, through the different things. And if you go to the next slide, it kind of showing my painting as a way to express not only who we are as people, but that cultural background and also how it relates to the fruits in the region and how we cultivate the landscape. Because I began to see that even my own identity was something that was being molded by my environment, by the built space, by the meals that I would eat, but also how us as humans living in these spaces also affect the environment, affect what we're growing and what we're making. So I began to think more larger of like, what is a portrait? How do I reflect the human body in a way where you're not so focused on the individual, but their entire kind of cultural presence. And in the next slide, it really kind of goes into these portraits that I call them, because in this one, I took all the plants from my yard in Jamaica and all things grown from bougainvillea, guinea, you guys have guinea? So these, and made these little kind of bouquets out of different fruits and things, and that I see as a portrait because that's showing my home space, showing partially how I grew up was, I went to school and stuff in Miami, but in the summers and winter breaks, my parents would ship us to Jamaica because they thought we were becoming too American, so we would stay with our grandma, and we would just spend our summers in Jamaica. But I appreciated it. We would be going to all the rivers and different stuff and going right along with our cousins. And then this is kind of a hand of bananas that was grown in our yard, but also I put all of my father's jewelry, because he wears a lot of jewelry with pendants and different things, to show how these objects and things that we have around us tell so much about who we are, more so sometimes in how we look or whatnot, and there's stories behind it. So if you go to the next one, and really just began to see how my painting work began to inspire photography. And I think photography, for me, started while I was in architecture school, where I had no extra time because when you're in architecture, you're just in the studio working all the time. So I still wanted to upkeep my art practice and still make art. So I started this series where I would just literally, while I was in Jamaica and breaks and stuff, I'd just go and get all these different plants from our yard, and I'd have my family members hold it. And it also allowed my family to be a part of my art. Sometimes they liked it, sometimes they didn't. But I'm always begging them to be a part of the process. And then if you go to the next slide, it shows kind of how over the years it just built up, where I began to document these different fruits that we would grow in different ways that I saw. These things that were grown in our yard and around us became almost like religious motifs and things because of how much history they had behind them, how it talked about our connection to the landscape, and also being just influenced by the different roles that played in Jamaica, whether it's like social class, gender, race, and beginning to tell these stories through simple hand gestures and also colors and these different things. So now I've kind of made probably about 30 to 50 different portraits of fruits. It's just going to continue to grow. And in the next slide, going more so when I started to put in people into the photography and looking. So lighting and color, I look at it in my work as lighting and color are just as important as the figure in my work, because it helps me to be a part of the storytelling, because I'm using lighting to help direct you visually through the scene, but also creating layers in the same way that you would do in a painting, and applying that. And in the next slide, this series I created was during the pandemic, when everybody was inside their homes, and I had, from then I moved from New York back to Miami, and was just working from home and just seeing where my childhood home, and it's such a different space because I moved back to my parents, and seeing kind of this space as one where there was so much kind of exploration of reimagining the space that I had grown up in, but through the lens of using my niece and nephew who were from over. And in the next slide, kind of just documenting these different experiences, because during the pandemic, everyone was so separate, and a lot of us, our families are expansive. You know, your friend down the street is considered your auntie or that sort of thing, and talking about that dynamic was interesting in the pandemic, where you were no longer seeing these people but I just asked people, different people that I knew, friends and family, could I just come over and document? So this was like one of my friends where in the pandemic, her family from Haiti moved to Miami to live with her. So her house that was typically just 4 people now had like 8 to 10 people in it. And I thought that was so interesting of how they were even surviving that during the pandemic and being in such a tight space, but looking at how they would have these big dinners and stuff, and finding the different ways that the pandemic altered the way that we lived, especially Caribbean and Black people. And in the next slide, kind of just really looking at the ways in this space, how are you transforming the way that we're living? How can I also look at just everyday life and give it a new feeling and allow you to kind of delve into this world? And if you go to the next slide, I began to play around with how this work was shown. So not just kind of putting on a wall, but thinking of the wall as like a family portrait or how you would in your home put up different works or different experiences. And what I noticed was that when I started to play around with how I'm kind of creating these compositions, it also was creating new storylines between the images. And even though all the images were photographed separately, it looks like one complete storyline of one different things. And I also realized that during that time, because I was doing this project, I got to experience a lot of things that happened in my family that no one else did besides the people who were in that scene. So like my cousin got engaged and I got to photograph their engagement and no one else had seen it. Or like my brother and his wife had their first child and I got to photograph them and those things. So looking back, it was almost like I was archiving all these different events happening in our family, but through my artistic, lens and lighting and color. And it really just became an exciting way where I realized that I was documenting these communities and people and the ways that we were living. And I've done kind of a couple different shows. If we go to the next slide, where I began to think, how do I bring back in the architecture? In my work, I was creating 2D work, but seeing how do I talk about the spatial gestures, the ways that we're living. And so in my exhibition, I began to bring in items of architecture into imprinting on them. So here you have like the grill gates that's on the porch or veranda, and putting an image behind it that was of my grandfather's yard, which is typically where all my family would meet in Miami and we would just hang out, but no one was doing that during the pandemic. Or curtains, and I see curtains and door frames as these kind of thresholds between your private family life and the outside world. So viewing these as viewpoints that I can, if you go to the next slide, use the imagery that I was photographing and put it in a new way so that you're also experiencing it not just as one dimension. You get to see the spatialness and also the scale changes of how big, and you really get to step into not only see the images, but get to experience it in so many different ways. So it's been nice to see or find different ways that I can bring back in architecture and all those years of studying back into my artistic practice. And now kind of, I feel like I'm in a space where I have an understanding of what I'm trying to do and how I'm trying to do it. And if we go to the next slide, I also, for this project, because it was during the pandemic, I was able to work with this public art organization to have them put them around the city so that people could see them as they're walking, because not many people were engaging with art because everybody was inside their house. And it was funny because I didn't even know when they released it, but people were sending me photos when they were just walking around Miami, and they're like, is this your mom? Is this who is this? Like, or like my cousin saw it, I was like, this is me. So it was nice to just kind of have these out there for people to experience. And in a way, I think sometimes art galleries or certain people don't feel like it's an accessible space for them, but this was a way to create a much bigger dialogue of like accessibility to art, and having a series that was so, also these scenes that were so intimate and in the home, we put in this very public space for people to look into and see. Was also just really exciting to hear people's feedback. And now it was funny because when I first started the project, people didn't really want me to take photos, because they're like, what's going to happen to the photos? But after they saw them on the street, they're like, oh, can you take a photo of me? On a billboard and different things. So it was funny to see my family, everybody now wants a photo. Everybody wants their photo taken. And so it was nice to just see this series grow over time. And in the next I was also documenting the landscape in a similar way, and in this time, I had this series called Rhythmic Landscapes and Patterns of Identity, which were a series of photos that I took in Jamaica and then in Florida in the Everglades. And I was comparing these landscapes because Florida has a unique history. When it was under Spanish rule, a lot of runaway slaves would run to Florida because slavery wasn't a thing there in that time, and they would be maroons and create their own communities. So they lived in the wilderness free. And a lot of them joined a lot of indigenous communities, and Jamaica also has a history with maroons, and so this here. So I was just looking into those different storylines, but in my research I found that there was a group of black painters in Florida who would just go around documenting the landscape, and they made, I think someone said, over 20,000 paintings that people are now trying to collect and find. But it was a group of 25 painters who would paint that way so that they didn't have to work in the Jim Crow South, so with all segregation and different things, the working conditions were tough. So instead of doing that, they would make paintings, and they would drive around in their cars and sell these paintings to people in order to make money. And it created this whole kind of community of painters who worked together and exchanged skills. They're called the Florida Highwaymen because they would go along the highway and just sell paintings out of their car. And now people are now seeing the value, and now people are trying to collect their work because they're learning the story and seeing how all these people were connected, but also the work that they were doing. So this series I took, and I was just like, how can I document these landscapes? How can I talk about the connections between them? And in this also find my own way of documenting the landscapes that, I grew up in. And if you go to the next slide, it was kind of just like reimagining it and testing how am I using my lighting in different ways and creating foreground and background. So this one is in Jamaica, and this was like an old gully that now grew into this. And in the next slide, seeing these different photos, so different ways to show you something or a space that looks familiar, but using color and lighting to reintroduce it to you in a whole different way. And so this kind of inspired me to not only think about what you're viewing visually, and for this series I worked with a sound artist, and we created a mixtape that had recordings from the environments of Jamaica and the Everglades. I would go recording sounds, and then we paired it with, I did audio of like me talking about the work and my process, and then we mixed dancehall, R&B, and reggae music together to create a soundtrack that paired with the work. So as you're viewing the series, it was like in a hallway, you would go through the different environment sounds and also these different artists and talk about how in my work it's kind of this mixture, or like how you would mix a track or a DJ track in the same way of how I'm mixing these two environments together through the artwork. So I really enjoy mixing different mediums and working that way. That was my first time ever working with sound and music, which was very tough.
Sound around you? Or?
So we played it out loud, so they would hear it as they kind of go through it. But it's also accessible because I did it with Soho House, and they have it on their website now, and you can listen to it. And the idea was that this series was a beginning for me to just experiment with another medium that I hadn't before, and I had so much respect for people working with sound. I didn't think it would be so difficult to kind of listen to every single file a million times, pairing it and doing different things. And even though that may not be something that I will do far or super deep into, I love experimenting with my work and learning these new things and learning from different people that I work with. And in the next slide is kind of beginning to document the Everglades. And in my time here, I did a residency there out in the Everglades, which was 1 month as well. And it was such a different experience because I grew up in Miami, and Miami is nothing like the Everglades at all. And it was a very eye-opening experience. Even though I lived in Miami and the Everglades was like 1 hour away, I had only been there once in my entire life until here. And when I was going, my parents are like, why would you want to go live in Bush? Like, why are you going here? And I was like, it's just an experience, just something. But it was really nice to go there and spend so much time and think about, while I was reading these stories of these maroons and the places that they walked through, to go and actually walk through those same places and follow those storylines. And it was just super nice to also see somewhere that was so close and delve into the history where I thought there was no Black history or history to my own narratives, to find out that this part in the Everglades was also where a lot of Jamaicans who immigrated into Florida came through. So seeing that this space also used to have a Caribbean population of Cubans, Bahamians, Jamaicans who would all be coming to Florida, and that's where they would enter through. And so it was super interesting to learn that history. If you go to the next slide, just kind of really looking at these spaces through these different lighting and colors. And I'm always trying to make my photos look like paintings, so I'm always playing around with these different layers. And if you go to the next one, kind of just seeing these different landscapes in different ways, and how I'm kind of playing with the foreground and the background and different ways of photographing it so that you're looking and yes, this is grass, but it also can look like paint strokes or brush marks because it's more abstracted because of how close it is in frame. And if you go to the next slide, this is kind of one of my more recent series that I did last year, which was called Bougainvillea, like the plant, but really wanting to make a series of work that was interdisciplinary and where I got to show different skills. And so while I was studying architecture, I also did a minor in fashion and design just because I was like interested and learned a lot about like costume design and different things. And there's also a lot of ties between architecture and fashion and just how you're structuring an environment and making things. And I wanted to make a series that was about the costume and what we dress and how we reflect our cultural history through the clothing that we wear. So I made this series that was based on how dance hall culture and music influences fashion in Jamaica. If you go to the next slide, really looking into these different stories. So I was taking different folklore from Jamaica and also history stories. So like we had Queen Nanny at the Maroons, and I made an entire look that was like based on her and these like white fabrics, and also playing around with these different jewels and details. So it became so much about ornamentation and this idea of building these different characters who would exist. So I worked with one fashion designer named Diana Eusebio from Miami, who I also went to, we've known each other for like 10 years. And then my other friend, Nadia Wolf, who worked on the graphics. So this was a bit like, I was kind of creative directing everything and working and producing the imagery, but it was nice to work with other people who are skilled artisans in their own way to bring this to life. And if you go to the next image, kind of building out a space that you're not only looking at the photographs or things, but you can feel the environment. I always talk about how, for me, culture impacts architecture, how you're viewing it, how you're moving through it, and creating these viewpoints so that as people would walk through in the exhibition, it would frame them in their own clothing and stuff. So for the opening of this, I was like, I don't want to do a traditional opening, so I just threw a dance hall party, and I hired a DJ. The street was so full. We had like 400, 500 people come out because they just saw a party on the street, and it was so full. So you wasn't really worried about the artwork, but it was an experience, and everybody talks about it. They were like, oh, that party you threw, and I was like, what party? And they're like, oh, the exhibition. But everybody got to come and see the work in such a different way, and also engulf them into the culture that I was talking about. And I think those sorts of experiences are what I'm more interested in art. Like it can be such a different way of showing it to people. If we go to the next one, really like looking into these different layerings or how I'm kind of building up this photograph onto this wall that I built that has another image, and seeing these different layers and symbols. And I've been working with textiles a lot to create these kind of big spatial moments to allow you. So this is like, I believe this is like 12 by 15 feet. So I'm getting to work with such a larger scale by working with the fabric and allowing me to go right into these scenes. And so in the exhibition, we got to show the mask, we got to show the entire process to people. And if you go to the next slide, really kind of also my entry into, I guess, photography was also set design. So I use a lot of those skills that I learned from architecture to build this space and build out a set where we were able to use the same fabrics and imagery but make it look like you're in an actual space, and styling all of these. And this is probably the biggest shoot I had ever done because it was probably, I mean, like with all the models, it was already like 12 models, and then the team and everything was like 20 people that I had to kind of work with and direct, and that was also a different headspace to be in, where trying to manage everything, but also really getting a feel for this. So it was really nice because we got to shoot it in this really cool theater and bring it to life and play with all this layers of lighting and stuff. So it was like really exciting. And if you go to the next slide, kind of allowing this space to come together, where I'm now bringing in the architecture in a very real and physical way to kind of create the way that people move through the exhibition, that they look at the work and kind of walk through it. So it's been great to explore in this way, and I hope that, you know, one day if I get a budget to build something even big, that's a big part with like installation, because it's so temporary and it's very expensive and time consuming, but when you have a good budget, it allows you to really experiment and transform spaces, and that's why now I've been merging and looking towards public art as a way to kind of bridge my art with other people and spaces and back into architecture. We go to the next slide. So we also did we did the party in the beginning, and then I worked with a poet, a Jamaican poet, a violinist, and a Afro burlesque dancer to create a performance about this exhibition, where I talked about, or the idea of the show was named Bougainvillea, or how I talked about, because in dancehall music it's very lively, but some of the things they talk about are very dark and talk about the state of the country and how this very beautiful thing can also be deadly in the same way. So in the performance, I created this garment where this is the side, but the other side was kind of this like black charcoal color with all these different chains and things, and throughout the performance, the dancer would shed the garment and then would turn it around, and then it turned into this festive thing to talk about that layering of how the culture and all these very serious topics are kind of combed into these very lively music and different things, and how, you know, we use art as an expression to talk about the way that we're impacted, our emotions. So it's a very like layered experience. And then I had the violinist play dancehall music on violin, which is very interesting to hear. But it was a really great performance, and getting to work in that way just opened me up to new things. And if you go to the next slide now, it's kind of me talking about where I'm now bringing architecture back in a public art way. And I've been very interested in kind of the porch or veranda or gallery, whatever you want to call it, a million names for it. But looking at this as a social space between public and private, and how this space not only nurtures community, but also serves as a space where people sell things. It brings commerce. It allows people, different generations, to interact and engage with each other and delve into these storylines. So I've been looking at this as almost this very sentimental, cultural, and spiritual space for many homes and families, especially in the Caribbean. And now I'm trying to realize, how do I turn that into a more public space or form of artwork? And if we go to the next slide, I've been building these things. So with the grill work, from the porch grills or ironwork, the metal work that you see, I've been now building or conceptualizing these architectural spaces where I would find porches in the city. So this is like a laundromat, and extending the porch into this big architectural form that will serve as this like cultural space for people to hold performances and arts cultural spaces, and thinking of how do we reclaim that public space for the public, and use the porch as an idea or concept that we can continue to build with. And hopefully in Miami, I'm now kind of working with some architects and developers to find spaces where a project like this can be realized, but this project also needs budget. And now I am initially starting a very small scale version of it that's probably only like 10 by 12 feet, where we're building into this neighborhood a small version of this to just kind of use as a small sculptural space, but hoping that, you know, as career continues and goes on, we can begin to build, because right now in Miami, there's so many things changing in the city, and a lot of that is deteriorating the cultural fabric of architecture in the city. Everything's very modern, simple. It's taking away a lot of that. So a lot of my work also is like, how do we preserve culture and the storytelling with it, and I'm just using architecture as my way to express that. And yeah, so it's been really exciting, and hoping to, I feel like I'm going to end up being an architect again in the long run. My friends always joke, they're like, you change your mindset every 5 seconds, and you know, maybe it happens that way, but it's just been a very exciting time, and I think this is the end. It's the last time. So thank you.
Can become a rapper.
So tell us before you end a little bit of your insight into Suriname, even though it's very short.
It's been a short time. My first thing is always the food. The food has been great, but I think it's been interesting because this is one of the few spaces that I feel like has so many different cultures, but all are shown, expressed. Like, because even in cities like Miami, there's a lot of different cultures, but some cultures are more dominant than the others. Where here, I feel like it's all these cultures all at the same time, and it's creating its own kind of language and environment. But it's been really great being here and seeing that. In a way, seeing it through the architecture, seeing it through the people, seeing it through the language, and I think there's all these different levels that I've been experiencing culture here. And also, I think it's just been nice for me to move at a slower pace. I think I love the pace here where it's definitely more time to just experience and take in things. And I've just also just been walking around and seeing different spaces. So that has been really nice. And I think even into the city, like the countryside, I went out one day and drove and seeing like just the natural landscape was really nice. One thing I keep saying out here, the trees are so big. In Miami, we don't have trees. I think so it's just nice to be like enveloped into this natural space. And I've enjoyed it every single day. And I also encourage, like, I'm already ready to come back again, just because it's been so nice. And I feel like I'm just now understanding the space where I think it took some time to kind of understand how Suriname works and what the culture is like. And now I want to kind of go further in looking into it. And I think it also has been in part just like learning the history. And I think especially because I was looking a lot into the different architecture and different things and seeing kind of how these different cultures and people and just like timelines and history have been impacting the kind of architectural fabric of how the city is built or the different ways that it works has been like exciting to see. And yeah, so it's been great.
Have you been far out of the city though, or just in Paramaribo?
I've just kind of really been Paramaribo, and then we went to
all the way to Brooklyn.
yes. So then
That's far.
so yeah, so one day we did go explore. We went to Udin Savan and so we got to experience. I got to leave the city and see more.
Right.
Did you stop at the Savannah?
Yes. So we walked up. Yes. Yeah, so we went, and that was super nice. It was very quiet. Like there was no, it was kind of just us out there. There weren't many other people, but it was really nice to see it. And I was like, there's so many beautiful plants here, like flowers, and we kept seeing the blue butterfly, the really big one. So that was just like really nice to be in that kind of more natural space.
I was just wondering if you'd seen any of the maroon villages in the architecture that they have with the Timbed or with
Yeah, I haven't yet, but I'm supposed to tomorrow. So I'm going.
I'm going to send them tomorrow.
It
is I tried gone out work, but it's village is busy, so I'm going to send them to Kisway.
So we'll see, that'll be another story to add.
Yes, I think you see really a bush museum.
I don't think it's in the Everglades, but
As you said, you're coming back probably. I think you should, because Suriname is a nice mix, as you say, and it's different from its no dominance. And, but behind all the images, there's more.
Yes.
And I think this is a very spiritual country as well. And I think if you see the outers,
Yes.
like
you have to see what's behind the images as well. Because, like, for instance, you did something with jewelry and stuff. Well, here, don't ever wear jewelry just like that. It's not